In this edition of Black Agenda Television, Bruce Dixon looks at the growing loss of black political power over their schools and community, especially in those places where African Americans are majorities of the population. And we'll examine the volatile situation in South Africa, where 2 decades of black majority rule has failed to unseat entrenched white power. But first, there's a scarcity of African Americans in President Obama's cabinet. But Glenn Ford says black folks should be more upset about the policies of this administration, rather than the number of black faces in high places.
The Congressional Black Caucus is disappointed. They're indignant and upset with President Obama. Why? Because there are so few African Americans at the highest levels of Obama's cabinet. Harlem Congressman Charles Rangel goes so far as to say that he's embarrassed at the lack of black faces in high places in the administration. The Black Caucus reasons that since blacks voted so overwhelmingly for Obama's re-election, their loyalty should be recognized and rewarded through cabinet appointments. Well, there are 2 things wrong with that reasoning. First, political constituencies are not necessarily rewarded for their loyalty. Rather, they are given recognition and rewards in order to keep them loyal. In other words, there must be a credible threat that if a politician does not do right by one of his constituencies, they will stop being so loyal. That's why President Obama has been acting so very grateful to Latinos. Hispanics gave about 70% of their votes to Obama last year, somewhat more than in 2008. But at least 93% of blacks cast their ballots for the president, and black voters still outnumber Hispanic voters. Obama feels the need to curry favor among Latinos in order to keep their loyalty and build on it. Latinos made demands on the administration, especially regarding immigration. Blacks have made no demands of Obama in either of his presidential contests. So, the Congressional Black Caucus should be embarrassed for selling their loyalties and black interests so cheaply. Of course, President Obama takes the black vote for granted. Black leadership, including the Black Caucus, has given him no reason to do otherwise. The Black Caucus is all caught up in symbolism, but neglects the fundamentals of substance. The caucus wants a blacker cabinet. But what good are black cabinet members if administration policies work against black people's interests and against the interests of humanity at large? Eric Holder is the nation's first black attorney general. He presides over the federal prison system, whose inmate population continues to increase while state prison populations decline. Eric Holder justified President Obama's preventive detention law, declaring that due process does not necessarily mean access to the courts. Effectively, whole sections of the Bill of Rights have ceased to exist under this president. And yet, all the Congressional Black Caucus seems to be upset about is that we don't have more Eric Holders in high positions. The Black Caucus would have loved to see Susan Rice elevated to Secretary of State, a job held by 2 blacks in the Bush administration. Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell were warmongers and liars. If anything, Susan Rice is worse. She has been an active participant in a U.S.-Africa policy that has left 6 million Congolese dead since 1996. She supported U.S. policy in Somalia that led to what United Nations observers called the worst humanitarian crisis in Africa. And she is credited with convincing President Obama to wage a 7-month bombing campaign against Libya, which has now plunged much of North Africa into chaos. Susan Rice has more blood on her hands than Condoleezza Rice. She is the symbol and substance of evil. Yet, the Congressional Black Caucus wants more people like her in the cabinet, which says volumes about the Black Caucus and the bankrupt state of what passes for black leadership in the United States.
When black majority rule came to the Republic of South Africa in 1991, President Nelson Mandela was one of the world's most famous men. Many millions of people all across the planet were inspired by the words of the African National Congress's Freedom Charter, which promised land to the people and popular ownership of the country's mines and industries. But that has not come to pass. Instead, economic disparities in South Africa are among the worst in the world. How has this come to be? Glenn Ford explores that question with South African political activist Molefi Ndlovu.
Our guest is Molefi Ndlovu. He's a political activist and researcher for the Center for Civil Society at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. That's in Durban, South Africa. Welcome to Black Agenda Television.
Thank you very much, Glenn.
Everybody in the world knows the name Nelson Mandela, but there are also millions of people, non-South Africans, who remember at least some of the words from the African National Congress's Freedom Charter. It's a document that many people consider a kind of promise to the South African people, and I'd like to read just a few passages from it here.
Sure.
It says, "The national wealth of our country shall be restored to the people. The mineral wealth beneath the soil, the banks, and the monopoly industry shall be transferred to the people as a whole, and all land shall be redivided amongst those who work it." None of this has come to pass in the 20 years or so since the first non-racial elections. What happened?
Well, there's a lot of things in between. One of them was that, to start off with the Freedom Charter itself, not everyone felt that it was a universally shared vision, in the sense that it gave the same ownership and entitlements to both the previous oppressors and those that were supposed to come out of oppression. So from that point on, people like Robert Sobukwe and others were critical that the Freedom Charter sets a goal that is not possible to achieve in the context of wide inequality, in the context of massive theft of land and disappropriation of African people in the country. So even that given, the promises of the Freedom Charter were undermined by the nature of the transition. As you know, South Africa did not go through a revolutionary seizure of power. In fact, what happened was that there was a negotiated settlement which was set to a large extent on the terms of the apartheid regime, in the sense that it acknowledged the continuity of certain elements of South African society, specifically the economic elements of what made South Africa what it was, the giant of the African continent in terms of the economy. So the transition was such that it gave political rights in a rhetorical sense that the Constitution gave, and recognized Africans as humans, which was not the case in apartheid. But it did not go further to elaborate how those rights are to be attained. So in the Constitution, for instance, following up to the Freedom Charter, or the spirit of the Freedom Charter, there's all sorts of the Bill of Rights in the South African Constitution details that everyone has got the right to dignity, to life, to health, and so on. Yet within the Freedom Charter, the South African Constitution, there's also a clause there which is called the Limitation Clause, which means all of these rights are there to be taken in the context that the state is able to afford to give these rights. So, for instance, one of the biggest constitutional cases was involving the provision of emergency health care to a man who was sick of sugar diabetes and needed dialysis machines, and the state used the conditions of the limitation clause within the Constitution to say that to give such emergency care would take away resources that the state does not have, and so therefore the limitation clause was applied to say that the resources are not there.
So the excuse for the last 20 years has been that the South African state cannot afford a social transformation.
Precisely. The reason why the South African state cannot afford it was that also that the ANC inherited a largely bankrupt state, in the sense that with the transition to democracy also meant that there were fundamental reforms that had to be taken in the state, and these took a tone of a neoliberal turn, which was in vogue in the early 90s, which said that the state has to be reduced, privatization has to be adopted, neoliberal economic processes to be applied through all sectors of South African life. So whereas the Freedom Charter sees the state as the main facilitator for some of these changes to happen, the economic policies made it that the state cannot become a leader in the transformation, that the state should take a backseat and instead give the space for private capitalist development to be the one that solves some of the contradictions of South African society.
Well, where is the space for the people's development?
Well, in the rhetoric, we should give credence to what has happened to this point. There has been an effort, at least in the part of the liberating forces, that was the ANC and others that were in government, to say at the level of rhetoric that there is an acknowledgement that the state ought to have the interests of the people at heart. So in people voting for the state, it was almost like giving the power to make these changes to the state. But at the same time, the state was also subject to a lot of pressure, unequal pressure, in the sense that the interests of business to a large extent dominated what choices are available and so on. So the people at the moment feel like their power was limited to the vote. But beyond the vote, some of the micro and macroeconomic concerns are taken off the public agenda and are discussed in fora like what they call NEDLEC, which is sort of a coming together of the state, private enterprises and labor, and negotiating around things like economic policy, around labor legislation, and also around things related to what they call black economic empowerment. So those negotiations are outside of the realm of public participation and cannot really be influenced by the vast majority of the population in South Africa.
The South African state also has a rather straightforward policy of black capitalism, which smacks to many as, well, a policy of not overcoming corporate domination of society, but joining it, or at least some black folks joining it.
Yes, it follows the precepts of trickle-down policy. The sense is that, as the crumbs fall down, more and more people will be able to eat enough to get onto the table. But for the past 20 years, the policy shows that it does not work, because what has actually, it has translated to is that a lot of the political elites who themselves, before 1994, were amongst the people in the sense that they were economically disempowered, have used the opportunities opened up by being in positions of power politically to accumulate at the expense of the vast majority. So that's why today we can speak of South Africa as being the most unequal society in the world, more than Brazil and other places. It seems like the trend is growing, not reducing, but actually the numbers of the level of inequality is deepening by the day. So you find a very small minority of African empowered people, what we call the black diamonds, who are amassing massive amounts of wealth in South Africa, but their role is really to become sort of middlemen, or people that push the envelope for the main people that hold the power in the economy, which is the same old multinational corporations that were operating during apartheid. And now the middle class plays the role of being middlemen and not really facilitating a change in the ownership dynamic and so on of the economy. Yeah.
One name that comes up in that vein is Cyril Ramaphosa, who may still, some people think, become president of South Africa. He was head of the Mine Workers Union, and now he sits on the board of a company that owns the mine at which 34 miners were massacred last August.
Yes, I mean, the sad fact is that, and I speak with a bit of caution because we've just had a national conference of the ANC a month ago, which decided on Cyril Ramaphosa as the deputy president of the ANC. And so the way the ruling party has been operating is at the national conference, the leadership of the party is elected, and that leadership ultimately becomes the candidate, stand for candidature for presidential elections and so on. So more than being, a wealthy capitalist and so on, he might as well become the deputy president of the country, which, by the way, is kind of interesting because there had been a lot of media coverage of the fact that when the massacre happened in Marikana, the president, Mr. Jacob Zuma, was out of the country, and there has been speculation with some substance to say that actually it was Mr. Ramaphosa who had spoken in a language that sort of encouraged the sort of reaction that the police had against the miners. It's calling them criminals, rogues, and that the force of the state must come down as hard as possible. So in light of that, yet he's still the person that was elected as the deputy president of the party and likely the deputy president of the country. So it tells you a little bit, not so much about the character of Cyril Ramaphosa as a person, but also about the nature of the ANC and the direction it seems to be taking, which is really in the interest of the vast majority of the people that are feeling the pinch of the, in the US you talk about the financial crisis. We've been living in crisis forever, and it seems like the crisis is going on even deeper for most people. And so in the choices that the party makes, it makes a lot of us a bit nervous around exactly where is the soul of the party going.
The Marikana massacre shocked the world. Was it a turning point in South African political history?
To some extent it was. Actually, it was the most brutal expression of the kind of difficulties people who try to voice their discontent are faced with. I think it was the epitome of years of similar actions by ordinary people. As you know, South Africa again is one of the leading sites for social unrest and protest, more than China, with a population of, in South Africa, at least 43 million people. So there's been recorded protest actions across South African townships that pass the numbers of 100 a month. So there is a sense that there's a growing discontent on the ground, and people are also getting tired of the traditional organizational forms, because a lot of these organizations have also compromised a lot for the positions that they hold, and so a lot of people revert to, spontaneous action, as forming little organizations like what now is called social movements and so on. And so Marikana was actually an opportunity to show the types of difficulties people are feeling. And though there were 34 people killed in Marikana, there's been in the past 10 years is a certain tendency in the way that the police handle social unrest to revert to violence, and not only like rubber bullets and so on, using live ammunition, because there's a sense, I don't know where it's coming from, but there's a sense that the police force has to show, you know, strength, and to show strength is to instill fear, and to instill fear you must kill. And so Marikana sort of becomes a sort of a climax of that kind, the tendency that seemingly is developing in the police and security forces of the country.
Well, you have certainly educated and informed us and broadened our worldview here on Black Agenda Television.
In recent decades, state authorities and corporate forces have reasserted themselves, seizing power over community institutions that were once locally controlled, including the public schools. Bruce Dixon has this commentary.
Detroit, Michigan, and suburban Atlanta's DeKalb County, Georgia, each have about 700,000 people, and both have black majorities. DeKalb at 55% and Detroit with 83%. They have something else in common as well. In both cases, financial emergencies, fiscal crises have been declared, which have allowed under new state laws local elected governments to be swept aside. In both Detroit, Michigan and DeKalb County, Georgia, black and white elites together have declared these fiscal crises. As Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, says, the elite never want a perfectly good crisis to go to waste. So the local elected governments in DeKalb County, Georgia, the school board, and in Detroit, Michigan, City Hall itself have been set aside by state law so that the governor can appoint stooges to impose massively unpopular programs of austerity, wage, pension, benefit, and service cuts, and privatization. Quite simply, what austerity regimes do is they turn local government from an entity which collects local taxes and fees in order to pay its employees living wages to provide needed services into a machine which collects local taxes and user fees from the poor and sends them straight to Wall Street as interest payments on an eternal, unpayable debt. Our black and white elites tell us that this is because Detroit, Michigan, and DeKalb County, Georgia, and hundreds of other cities and towns, state governments, and even the federal government, which prints its own money, have allowed spending to run out of control and have for some time lived beyond their means. The truth, however, is that local, state, and federal governments long ago stopped taxing the property and incomes of the wealthy, preferring to concentrate on the smaller property and smaller incomes of working people, making up what they should have got from taxing the rich by borrowing from them at interest. To make matters worse, our black and white elites bargained in bad faith with teachers and government workers across the country to avoid granting immediate wage increases to city, state, and local workers like those in Georgia, Michigan, Illinois, and every place else. They agreed to pension and benefit hikes, effectively money later instead of money now. But since they would not raise taxes on the rich, they never actually had that money to put in those pension funds. And now very soon, those pensions will be due. We noted that both Detroit, Michigan, and DeKalb County, Georgia, are majority black. Several smaller cities in Michigan have also been placed under emergency rule as well, so that more than half of Michigan's black population now live under unelected governments. And in Metro Atlanta, the second greatest concentration of African-descended people in North America, DeKalb's fate is a sword hanging over the majority black city of Atlanta and neighboring Clayton County as well. Is the whole thing racist? You could say that, but you wouldn't be explaining much of anything. Georgia's governor halted the appointment process of his stooges to demand more black representation. The Wall Street lawyers selected to shred and privatize what remains of Detroit is black as well. Both Georgia and Michigan have long-standing, well-entrenched black representation at all levels of government and among the jackals who want to sell Detroit's water system or the land beneath DeKalb schools for a dime on the dollar. Telling each other how racist it is, even suing in court for discriminatory impact, is worse than a waste of time. It's actual misdirection. But it's the best and the only explanation, besides the phony spinning beyond our means nonsense, that our black political class has to offer. In truth, unelected austerity governments might well be racist, but that doesn't tell us how to get rid of them. So it's not really useful information. The useful truth is that it's capitalism. It's disaster capitalism. It's vampire capitalism. Capitalism that turns everything into debt, and capitalism in which some of the bloodsuckers have black faces. For Black Agenda TV, I'm Bruce Dixon.
Our lineup for this edition of Black Agenda Television. You can visit the Black Agenda team every Wednesday for a new and provocative issue of our magazine, blackagendareport.com, and listen to us on Black Agenda Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. You can also tune in to the Black Agenda TV Express radio show on the GoPro Radio Network every Wednesday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time at goproradio.com. Black Agenda Report, Black Agenda TV, and Black Agenda Radio, the places for news, commentary, and analysis from the Black left. I'm Ayanna Jones.